magnetize your minis, flight stands, custom kits, and all the hobby supplies you'll need from themagnetbaron.com.
Hello and welcome to the YouTube channel for craftworld.eldar.com. I'm Brent, and in this video, I'm going to be talking about what has perhaps been the single most successful build archetype for Aeldari lists in competitive play in 2024. This is like the kind of list that does really well at a GT or some major tournament, and that is the triple threat Aeldari list. About half of this list is more or less predetermined with some flexibility, and the other half is up to you, which is one of the things that I like about it. It's a preset archetype that relies on the same three central tools, but there are a lot of different ways to construct it and play it, which is cool. So if you do decide to run this type of list, you can still sort of make it your own. Now, I do want to stress before I dive in two things, and one is that this is not the only way to play Eldar competitively right now. This is the single most successful individual archetype of lists, but there are a lot of archetypes of lists that have done pretty well. And here's the other thing. Aeldari are no longer the terror of the table that they were in 2023 and before. We have a very reasonable win rate, and there are weeks where Aeldari don't hit the podium in any GT anywhere in the world, despite the fact that there are a bunch of them. So I think the faction overall is in a good place. There are a lot of ways to play Space Elves well, but I do think that this one particular approach has gained enough traction, especially in the last 3 months, to deserve a video. So this is a video on the triple threat Aeldari list. Now, I'm going to start by discussing what exactly the list is, how it functions tactically, how each of the three parts functions individually, and then I'll discuss some modest variants to these three parts, and then I will discuss the other types of units you need to have in a list like this to balance it out without telling you exactly what you should include, because part of the fun of this game is not just running a net list, but making a list that's your own. Okay, so at its core, the triple threat Aeldari list is an aggressive durability build, which is unusual for Space Elves, right? Because like the Space Elf standard is maybe you have one hyper durable unit that's an anvil unit, but the rest of your army generally wants to keep its head down and stay out of line of sight and not maybe get aggressive until you have an advantage on your opponent because you've picked up some of their most valuable units. And this is how I usually play Space Elves. My sort of Space Elf comfort spot is I play super cagey until I have an advantage, and then I get hyper aggressive. And the triple threat Aeldari list usually, in almost all matchups, calls upon you to play Aeldari very differently. So you have about half the points in your army are invested in these pretty aggressive, pretty durable units. The standard triple threat is the Avatar of Khaine, 10 Wraith Guard with cannons led by a Spirit Seer, and Yvraine leading a large block of Harlequins. And then there are a number of ways that you can modify this. So you can include the Vizarch in this, which I like. I think that's cool. I just like the Vizarch. I think he does some cool things for the block. And you can decide to either run this big mob of Harlequins in a Wave Serpent or not. The Wave Serpent obviously increases mobility and durability and setting up charges. It kind of limits the way you can build out the squad because you're limited to 12 models instead of 14, which theoretically you can get to. And there's some advantages and disadvantages to both of those, and different versions of that third sort of head of Space Elf Cerberus have appeared in various tournament lists that have done very well, where it either like does or doesn't have the Vizarch, does or doesn't have the Wave Serpent. We'll talk about that. And then the rest of the units in the list are, for the most part, scoring units. Your Swooping Hawks, your Warp Spiders. You could run Shadow Specters, although my own sense is that this particular list doesn't really want them. There are also some points available to possibly include long-range fire support, which is another thing to consider. So we're going to dive down and we're going to dig in on this. I'll talk about like how to construct it and various ways to play it. I will say I'm going to move a little bit quickly as I talk about each of the 3 parts of the triple threat individually, for the simple reason that I have made videos about all of these individually. Like I have a video on the Avatar of Khaine. I have a video about Wraithguard. My Ynnead video. I have a video in which I talk about the advantages of having Yvraine lead Harlequins. So if you're a longtime listener, I assume that a lot of this stuff is not totally new. So it's going to be some like enough details for people who have never thought about these things before, but I'm going to try to not make it tedious for those of you who are regular listeners, and I'll focus on how these things synergize. So here we go. The basic premise of this list, right? The way that it plays is that instead of having 1 bully unit, you have 3 bully units. And what a bully unit is, generally is a big, dangerous, durable unit that's pretty good into most things, maybe into everything, and can seriously pack a punch. A bully unit can throw its weight around one part of the field and be a deterrent on objectives and be an answer to your opponent's particularly powerful units, be something that your opponent is going to want to respect and give space and maybe assign resources to eliminating. And the basic premise of this list is that it has 3 units that do this. Now, 2 of these bully units are more bullyish than one of these bully units, and for that reason, generally the way this list wants to play is to double threat with the Avatar of Khaine and the Wraithguard with the cannons led by the Spirit Seer in the first couple turns of the game, and then Yvraine and her Harlequins kind of come in either as like as a replacement, as a counterpuncher for when one of these other 2 threats gets taken down, or if neither one of them is getting taken down, to like help with cleanup. But if that's happening, then this is a win more move. If neither the Avatar of Khaine nor the 10 Wraithguard with cannons are either eliminated or just sort of like kept out of the game with clever positioning, then when you bring Yvraine and the Harlequins in, like, you were going to win that game anyway. So generally, Yvraine and the Harlequins become a way of keeping up pressure. So you have pressure and sort of a bully presence on the board either until the end of the game or certainly into the very late game. You get your opponent wrong-footed early on, and the idea is they just never really have the resources to deal with this. In order to give these units the durability that they need to operate in this role and be scary in the ways that they need to be scary, you need to like think about the way that you assign other resources. So the way you use lightning fast reactions and the way that you use fortune and the way that you spend other command points, it definitely matters. Also, playing this build does require some knowledge of how enemy armies work. Into a lot of matchups, you can afford to be incredibly aggressive out of the gate with both the Avatar of Khaine and the big block of Wraithguard, and that's kind of what this depends on. You need to just not play your Space Elves the way you usually would. You kind of get right in there. Certainly on turn 2. Maybe even on turn 1. There are going to be matchups against opponents with really, really powerful either counterpunch melee or long range shooting where you have to maybe be a little more clever, either by trying to make your opponent commit first or staying out of line of sight for a turn while you eliminate with shooting or just get position on a couple of key enemy units. And I'm not really going to try to go into detail about that now here, because these are that's a principle of pretty advanced play, knowing how to play this differently into very particular types of lists. But I will say, for example, like if you come up against a Tyranid list with triple exocrines, which are putting out D6 plus 3 blast shots, strength 9, flat 3 damage that really like put Wraithguard down, like maybe don't immediately commit to the Wraithguard in open ground. Similarly, if your opponent can dump mortal wounds on the Avatar of Khaine, then obviously you're going to play it a little bit differently. But normally, you're going to be pretty aggressive out of the gate with both of those units. You want to get into the midfield relatively quickly, take objectives, demand that your opponent challenge you or lose the primary objective game while they try to put pressure on these incredibly durable, incredibly dangerous units. You put your opponent in this impossible situation where you take control of the midfield, and they have to either like just let you outscore them, or they have to come out from wherever they are and then get absolutely devastated by these like primo damage dealing units. And possibly the best thing that can happen to you is that your opponent can get turn one and play aggressively into the midfield. That's just like, that is the worst way to play against this list, because then you just barrel in there with your Avatar of Khaine and your Spirit Seer with the Wraith Guard, and maybe even also your Harlequins, and just blast whatever's on those objectives off the objectives, and your opponent probably just won't have anything left to answer. Also, dropping stuff on your objective, on those midfield objectives early on, just gives you an opportunity to get extra movement by charging with the Avatar of Khaine or the Harlequins or whatever. Most opponents will be too smart to be quite that accommodating. So here's how you're going to make each of the individual three like Cerberus heads of this list work to your advantage. You need to max out durability and also the damage dealing potential of each of them. I'm going to lead with the Avatar of Khaine because I think this one is the most straightforward. And I think a lot of people listening to this video probably already kind of know how the Avatar works. It's such a cornerstone of so many Aeldari lists. It's straightforward for the simple reason that there are really only two buffs available to it, and because it's a single model, there just aren't as many synergies. So here's the Avatar's deal. He's a bully monster with a 10-inch move who's toughness 12. He has 14 wounds. He halves incoming damage with a 2-up save and a 4-up invuln, all of which is fabulous. And then if you throw Fortune on him with a Farseer, because he's toughness 12, the -1 to wound means that even pretty powerful weapons are generally only wounding him on a 5 or better. So that's really good. And you can, of course, also throw lightning fast on him because he's not a Wraith unit. So you can also make him -1 to hit. And that just makes him incredibly durable into most stuff in the game. Like, your opponent rolls out with some incredibly souped up, like, repulsor Space Marine tank thing or something with a whole host of different target elimination weapons, and opens up in the Avatar of Khaine, and he's probably just not going to take that much damage. Anything that does get through gets halved, and 14 is kind of a lot of wounds. And then when he hits back, he is an absolute monster, literally and figuratively. He's got a really powerful shooting attack, the Whale of Doom, his glowy sword that can also be a spear, that can also be an axe, that he can either chuck if it's a spear, or I like to imagine he like blasts with it like Link and Zelda. It's only got a 12-inch range, and it only has one shot, but it's sustained hits D3. Hits on 2, strength 16, which is freaking crazy. AP -4, then D6 plus 2. And this means that using fate dice, two things are true. One, you can guarantee that it does 1 plus D3 hits because it's sustained hits D3 with that ridiculously awesome, incredibly hard-hitting profile. Or you move the Avatar into the midfield, and at the end of your opponent's either move phase or at the beginning of their charge phase, the Avatar just, for 1 CP, blats something on Overwatch, and then you use a fate die, either a natural roll of a 6 or with a nearby Farseer, any fate die, to guarantee that the Avatar hits on Overwatch, doing 1 plus sustained hits D3. So 1 plus D3 hits, strength 16, -4, D6 plus 2. That can just like pick up an enemy light tank, in some cases an enemy heavy tank. You can also use the fate dice if you haven't had to hit automatically on Overwatch to just do flat 8 damage to something, which is freaking crazy. The Wailing Doom is an incredibly powerful shooting weapon. And that Overwatch trick, combining fate dice with the Whale of Doom, is just an Aeldari standard. Like, if you're running the Avatar and you're not doing that, you need to be aware of it. The Avatar just creates this bubble of 12 inches all around him, that the kind of thing that's good against the Avatar, that is big, tough, hard-hitting stuff, doesn't want to move into. It's also a great deterrent against being charged. And then should the avatar actually get into melee, there are two incredibly powerful melee profiles here. He's either got 6 attacks that hit on 2s, -4 d6 plus 2 damage, or 12 attacks that hit on 2s, strength 7 -2 flat 2, into something like Space Marines. There's nothing in the game that's okay with being in combat with the avatar. He can pick up hordes, he can pick up moderately heavy infantry, he can kill monsters, he blows up tanks. He is the god of war. That's what he is. He also bestows +1 to charge to models within 6 inches and to advance, which includes himself. So if on the first turn of the game you need to advance him to get him where he needs to go, he's actually going to move the move 10 plus d6 plus 1. And then should you charge, that extra 1 can help. The difference between having to make an 8-inch charge and a 7-inch charge statistically is relatively significant. So the avatar is just like this massive area denial beat stick of board control and high threat that you have the opportunity to further enhance with Fortune, the Farseer ability that on a 2-up on a d6 makes the model that it targets -1 to wound, which makes the avatar just incredibly hard to deal with. And then also lightning fast reactions, being -1 to hit, like that seriously affects your opponent's dice. So that's incredible. So you just use the avatar to dominate one section of the board. Knowing which section of the board that should be depends on where the objectives are and how your opponent has deployed resources, particularly the sorts of resources that could answer the avatar. Oh, the avatar is currently 335 points, which is expensive, but absolutely reasonable for how incredibly good it is. Okay, so the second tool available, 10 Wraith Guard with Wraith Cannons led by a Spirit Seer. The Wraith Guard are 380 points. The Spirit Seer is 65. So this is coming in at a hefty 445 points. It's almost a quarter of the points in your army, but wow, what a freaking tool this is. So the Wraith Guard, if you give them the Wraith Cannons, they move 6 inches. They're toughness 7, which is great. I love toughness 7 on heavy infantry. It's so good because there's just nothing that deals well with this. Anything that has good numbers for wounding them that doesn't involve some like weird combination of buffs. Anything that has good numbers for wounding them probably has a very low rate of fire. So that's awesome. So almost nothing is going to be particularly efficient into these things, except for something like the Exocrine, which I mentioned before. So Wraith Guard are toughness 7. They have a 2-up save, which is cool. So even when modified, they still end up with something decent. 3 wounds, OC1, 6-up leadership. And the Wraith Cannon that they carry is just crazy badass. It has an 18-inch range with 1 attack. Normally it would hit on 4s, but when led by a Spirit Seer, they hit on 3s like a normal elite unit. Strength 14. Woo! Better than a Las Cannon. Better than a Bright Lance. -4 AP. That's a lot. D6 damage. You can flub a D6 roll, but there are 10 of these things. And devastating hecking wounds. So on 6s to wound, the damage is just completely unblockable. Here's the other thing. If they're led by a Spirit Seer, they also get lethal hits, which, I mean, is just extra cool. I mean, strength 14 is great, but I'm not going to look some lethal hits, gift horse in the guest mouth. I don't know. And then once per battle round, when an enemy unit targets this unit, after that unit has finished shooting, this unit can shoot as though it was your shooting phase. So this is a little bit like Overwatch, but better. Your Wraith Guard, so your avatar goes into one section of the board and is like, I own this section of the board. Attempt to confront me. And in many matchups, what a smart opponent will do is simply play around the avatar, ignore it, be like, okay, that part of the board is yours. You get that objective, buddy. And I'm just going to play into the rest of your army. But not so in the triple threat Aeldari list, because your Wraith Guard just go wandering into the other part of the board And with their toughness 7 and their 2-up save and their war construct ability that lets them just shoot back at stuff that shoots them if it's within range, within 18 inches. And a Spirit Seer leading them, who then does this other really cool thing. On your turn, now this used to be on both players' turns, which was absolutely crazy. But now it's just on your own turn, which is A, more reasonable, and B, probably what was always intended. The Spirit Seer brings one of the Wraith Guard back from the dead. So you're just getting one of your badass 3-wound T7 Ghost Boys up again automatically for nothing. That's great. And if you want to make both the Avatar of Khaine and the Wraith Guard more durable, one like classic move is you give lightning fast reactions for 1 CP to the Avatar of Khaine, and you put the Farseer power Fortune on the Wraith Guard, such that even pretty powerful stuff like that Exocrine that would normally wound them on 3s now is only wounding them on 4s. Making them -1 to wound can make them much more survivable. There's very little in the game that is just going to be able to, like, there are very few opponents lists in the game that are going to be able to easily deal with a triple Wraith Guard build. A triple Exocrine Tyranid list is one of the only things that can just wipe this. I'll also just mention that, like, the fact that the Wraith Guard, charging into melee with the Wraith Guard is not necessarily a solution. They are a shooting unit, but they each have 3 attacks at strength 5. They don't have AP, but that's pretty good. And then the Wraith Seer is like actually kind of okay in melee against infantry anyway, although he doesn't have any AP. And you can always use that stratagem that lets you fall back and still shoot. So you're not really worried about them being engaged, even though they don't have big guns, never tire. Now you might be thinking to yourself, Brent, that's all well and good, but Wraith Guard are slow, and the unit that big can't go in any transports. So how do you get them into the part of the field where they do the thing? And I say to you, reasonable complainer, that in some matchups this isn't going to matter. They're infantry. Sometimes, depending on just how the field is set up on their first turn, you just make an advance move, and if you need to, you could use a Fate die. They're going to be able to get to where they need to be in the mid-board. You just start them in a ruin with an opaque first floor, pretty close to the middle of the board. And in games, in matchups where it's an issue, the trick that you pull is on their turn, they make an advance move, and the Spirit Seer has a move of 7. If you put the Spirit Seer at the front of the unit, you can kind of like cheat it a little bit. So it's almost as though the whole unit is moving 7, but then you make an advance move for an average move of like 10.5. And you can, of course, use Fire and Fade to then move with them again and just get them into the midfield so they like keep up with the Avatar. This is CP intensive, as is using Overwatch with the Avatar, as is potentially using Lightning Fast. And so I will say another one of the costs to run into this list is you absolutely need to make your Warlord an Autarch Wayleaper. But let's be honest, you were going to do that anyway because that's what we do as Eldar players. So you're getting 2 CP on your turn, 1 CP on your opponent's turn, and that makes it possible to afford to double move the Wraith Guard on the first turn of the game to get them into the midboard if you need to and still have CP available for defensive shenanigans on the Avatar. And you want to ideally creep up with the Farseer so it's close enough to let the Avatar of Khaine use Fate Dice to trigger auto hits on Overwatch, and then also close enough to throw Fortune on either the Avatar of the Wraith Guard or the Wraith Guard. Like if everything went according to plan, you'd sort of tri-point this, like the Avatar of Khaine and the Wraith Guard would each be to one side of the board center, which would have terrain in it, and you'd be using that terrain to block line of sight to move your Farseer up a little bit. Like there's a whole way to do this, which if you've played a bunch of 40K, I think probably you're picturing. The Fire and Fade trick is also a great trick for just getting the Avatar right up in your opponent's face and board layouts where that's what you need to do. please don't even consider running the Wraith Guard without the Spirit Seer. Newer players who are like, ooh, but I could save like 60 points. Do I really need that? Yeah, you really need that guy. There's absolutely no point in running Wraith Guard without the Spirit Seer. He's relatively inexpensive compared to the overall value of the squad, and the ability to hit on 3s instead of 4s and resurrect dead super heavy infantry is just, of course you want him. Of course you want him. But Brent, you're an Ibersil player. Don't you like Wraith Blades better? Can I do this same thing with Wraith Blades? Asked the person who wants that 4-up invulnerable save. The Wraith Blade variant is not bad. If you're going to run the Wraith Blade variant, obviously you do it with the axes and shields. The swords are just not good in this edition, which makes me sad because they're my favorite aesthetically. The axes and shields do have that 4-up invuln. I will say that because they start with a 2-up save anyway, and they can often get cover, like it doesn't really. It only really matters if stuff has better, if they're in cover, it has better than a -3 AP. So like actually it's not super important. There have been some big blocks of shields and axes and lists that have done pretty well. And in a triple threat, normally what happens, if you just play the blades and axes because they don't shoot, they can't do the thing that the Avatar does, the Wraith Guard does, it is easier for your opponent to just be like, I will play around those. You go ahead and have your over 400 points of models like standing on that one objective. You got it, buddy. I'm just going to play the rest of your army. You can't really get away with that in a triple threat list. So yeah, you can bring the axes and shields instead. I will say that I think the cannons do have a slightly better track record, and that incredibly potent anti-heavy infantry and anti-tank shooting is important, especially in a list that usually doesn't have enough points at the end to afford a bunch of dedicated long-range anti-tank. So you're kind of relying on the Wailing Doom and the shooting on the Wraith Guard to be your anti-tank, and you deal with the fact that they have limited range by getting them into the midfield really fast. Like they run into the midfield, and they're now doing the job that your Bright Lances or your Fire Prisms or maybe even your Fire Dragons would have done, although you will have enough points left over to have Fire Dragons if you really want them. Fire Dragons aren't super long range though. So like generally you don't have a ton of points left over for super long range shooting, and that's another reason to take the Wraith Guard over the blades, because there are going to be things that you need to kill at range. Okay, let's talk about the third head of the dragon here. So the third head of the dragon is Yvraine leading a large squadron of Harlequins with or without the Vizarch, in or not in a Wave Serpent. And before you get really mad and leave a spirited comment in the comments section telling me how there's only one way to do this and how dumb and wrong I am, you should know that lists that have finished in the top 3 at GTs have used all possible versions of this. All of these are tested and proved as like viable ways to do this. So it comes down to like what the meta is like and what else is in your list and your own personal play style and just what you like. I will talk about the merits and flaws of each, but here's the basic idea. The basic idea is that Yvraine leading a large squad of Harlequins is a dangerous and durable unit for a couple of reasons. The most obvious of these is that they're pretty quick, right? Harlequins are pretty quick. Yvraine is pretty quick because they move 8, and then they dump out a ton of attacks, and they're especially good into infantry for reasons that I'll get to in just a moment. And then like the Avatar of Khaine and the Wraith Guard, they're kind of weirdly durable. And they're weirdly durable for the simple reason that like nothing is super efficient into them. They're not as durable as those other 2 units, nor are they as expensive. Although that said, they're not cheap because the most inexpensive version of this build is still rolling in close to 300 points, and I actually think you want I think you want one of the slightly more expensive versions of it. at which point they do end up being as expensive. But Yvraine, so Harlequins they're only T3 and they only have 1 wound, but they have a 4-up invulnerable save, which is great. And Yvraine gives the whole squad a 5-up feel no pain. So your opponent has to roll to hit, and you can, of course, make them -1 to hit with lightning fast reactions if you wish. And then your opponent has to roll to wound. Probably they'll wound with most of their dice because elves are T3. But then half of those wounds are simply negated by invulnerable saves, and then another third of singular damage wounds are negated by a 5-up feel no pain. And then in your command phase, Yvraine on a 2-up just brings back D3 models to the unit, which is pretty great, and actually can add up to a significant amount of additional durability over the course of a game. Now, this is not quite as scary, again, as those other 2 units, which is why you tend to want to use it as a counterpuncher. It's like something you use in the second half of the game when a lot of your opponent's resources have been used up, and it becomes incredibly hard to deal with. But let's talk about what makes it scary and why you might consider adding the Visarch and the relative merits and disadvantages of putting them in a Wave Serpent. So we'll just start with Yvraine and the Harlequins. So Harlequins are probably, I think in all of 40K, Harlequins might actually be the most variable unit in terms of unit size and loadout, which has maybe always been true in terms of loadout. They don't have as many options as they used to have. The Harlequin special weapons have been simplified, but you can take this unit with either 5 models, 6 models, 10 models, 11 models, or 12 models, which is a lot of choices. So you can take 4 to 11 regular Harlequins plus 1 lead player. And the way the points come out, like, you're either going to want to take 10 Harlequins plus a lead player, and then just take Yvraine if they're going in a Wave Serpent. Or you're going to want to take 12 Harlequins plus Yvraine, and the Visarch or not the Visarch if they're not going in a Wave Serpent. And here's why. Here's how this works. The Harlequins, the lead player can be outfitted. You always want to give the lead player a fusion pistol and an Aeldari power sword. It's the only model that can have the Aeldari power sword, and it's just better than the other options. It has 5 attacks at hitting on 3s at strength 4, -2 AP, which is good with 1 damage. All the other players are going to want Harlequin special weapons, which are 4 attacks hitting on 3s, strength 4, -1 AP, 1 damage. And they all come default with the shuriken pistol, but up to 2 models can have, if there are 10 or fewer models in the squad, up to 2 models can have up to 1 model can have a neuro disruptor, and up to 1 can have a fusion pistol, and then, 2 of each, two neuro disruptors and 2 fusion pistols in the 10 or fewer model squad. And then if you have 11 or more models, you can give out up to 4 fusion pistols and up to 4 neuro disruptors. So one way to play this is if you're gonna, especially if you're gonna take a Wave Serpent, you cut off the players at 10, even though you could take 11. You add in a lead player, so there are 11 models, and you hand out 4 neuro disruptors and 4 fusion pistols. Now, the fusion pistol is still really good. It's not as good as it has been in previous editions, but it's really good. It's only got a 6-inch range. Hits on 3s, but it's strength 8, -4 AP, D3 damage, but melt at 2. So if you're within 3 inches, so if you're engaged with something or super close to something, D3 plus 2 is no joke. That means that if you're running a max size unit and you get close to like a tank or a monster, you're, even if it's toughness 12 or something, you still have like 4 shots that are going to wound it on 5s and maybe just go straight through its armor and do D3 plus 2 damage, which is like really freaking good. If you needed to, you could always get in there with some fate dice. The Neurodisruptor and the Shuriken Pistol both have a 12-inch range. They're both assault. The Neurodisruptor is anti-infantry with no AP. The Shuriken Pistol is not anti-infantry but has -1 AP. It's kind of neither here nor there. They're both kind of just like fine. But those fusion pistols are really good. More importantly, though, like Harlequins, they put out a ton of hits in melee, and when they charge, they get +1 to wound, which is really good. So the Aeldari Power Sword and all of the Harlequin special weapons, which are coming in at strength 4, because they have +1 to wound, they're wounding Space Marines on 3s. They're wounding ultra durable infantry and very light vehicles on 4s, and even stuff that's like incredibly tough. They're still wounding on 5s. They're still wounding in one out of 3 of the time, and then they've got a little bit of AP, or the sergeant has 5 attacks with like -2 AP, which is good. And the sheer volume of attacks is pretty crazy, you know? I mean, if there are 11 clowns in that list, then 10 of those are putting out 40 attacks in melee, and another 5 from the sergeant. That's 45 pretty good attacks with +1 to wound. And Yvraine is fabulous. She's so freaking powerful. She's got a ranged weapon, the Storm of Whispers, which puts out D6 plus 3 attacks, hitting on 2s. It's only strength 2, but it's anti-infantry 2. So any infantry unit, your opponent's Terminators, your opponent's Zoanthropes, your opponent's Dark Angel Knights, whatever it is, you're hitting those on 2s, you're wounding those on 2s, and then devastating wounds. So not only do they wound on 2s, but they ignore all saving throws on 2s. So it's D6 plus 3 attacks that hit infantry on 2s, wound infantry on 2s, and then your opponent can't make a save. And if your opponent can make a save, because it's not infantry, it's at -2, which is still good. So it's only 12-inch range, but so she slaps and shooting while your Harlequins are opening up with their fusion pistols and then some other stuff. And then in melee, she's got this sword with 5 attacks that hits on 2s. It's only strength 4, but it does devastating wounds, -3 AP, flat 2 damage, and she also benefits from the Harlequins +1. So it's only strength 4, but even if against something that's pretty tough, something that's T5, 6, or 7, she's still going to wound it on 4s on the charge because of the +1 to wound. She'll wound Marines on like 3s. And against something that's really tough, like a vehicle or a monster, she's still going to wound on 5s with -3 flat too. So this unit of Yvraine leading a bunch of clowns ends up being able to like utterly wipe out light infantry, wipe out heavy infantry, badly damaged monsters, badly damaged vehicles. Like all those attacks adds up to something. It's a bummer not to be able to give all of the Harlequins devastating wounds with the Troop Master, because you can't have that other leader character in the unit with Yvraine, but it's still really good. So you've got this unit that's like pretty good at close range shooting into anything, really good into infantry, fabulously hard hitting in melee if they charge, has a ton of models in it, has a 4-up invuln save, a 5-up feel no pain, and it's also just thematically cool and kind of unusual, like the priestess prophetess of the Aeldari death god leading a bunch of mysterious Harlequins is cool. That's just narratively interesting. It adds a little bit of exotic flavor to a typical Craft Worlds list, with which I like. And then you also have the opportunity of adding the Vizarch. And in my video in which I talked about the Ynnead, I talked about how much I personally like the Vizark. I think that the Vizark has kind of been a sleeper unit in 10th edition. I think it's actually really good. And I was really delighted to see it. The most recent triple threat list to do really well in a GT included a maximum size, like a 12 elf Harlequin troop with both Yvraine and the Vizark. So not in a Wave Serpent, because that's 14 models. It was at Michigan relatively recently, the Michigan GT. And it was run by Folger Piles. So if you're listening, Folger Piles, I want you to know that I admire your list. I think it's fun. It's cool. It's a neat twist on the triple threat list. So the Vizark, so the Harlequins make the whole squad at +1 to wound when they charge. And Yvraine is just bringing her own brand of beadassery and giving them all a 5-up feel no pain and letting them resurrect stuff. And then the Vizark, who is allowed to be added as another leader because he has a special rule that lets him do that when Yvraine is leading a squad, gives the whole unit fight first. I think if you're not putting them in a Wave Serpent, you need to have the Vizark, because that means that they can, like, this big block of clowns can sort of come up into the midfield conservatively behind a piece of terrain, able to, in a position where they can run in to support, like counterpunch either where the avatar is or where the Wraith Guard are. Or if you just know there's only one side of the board you're going to have to counterpunch on, that's where you put them. But you, like, have them keep their heads down early. But if anything that's quick does get through and tries to charge the clowns, because the one thing that Harlequins could conceivably die to is getting caught flat-footed by high-volume melee attacks. Well, the Vizark gives the whole squad fight first. And in 10th edition, the player whose turn it is not always triggers first with fights first. So it just guarantees that your Harlequins will always fight first. So that's amazing. And the Vizark is also, just in his own right, a very powerful combat character. He's 90 points, which is, not nothing, but not crazy. So he also moves 8 inches. He carries the Sword of Silent Screams. It's got 5 attacks. It hits on 2s, strength 5. But remember, if he charges with a bunch of Harlequins, he's at +1 to wound. So against something that's like T4, he's actually going to hit on 2s and then wound on 2s, because he would have wounded it on 3s. But the Harlequin special ability, if he's part of that unit, means he wounds on 2s. So if they charge 5 attacks, he hits on 2s, he wounds on 2s, -4 AP, flat 2 damage. But here's the thing, people. Get excited, because the Sword of Silent Screams has an ability kind of like what the Death Jester does. You can decide at the end of the phase, until the end of phase, when you're selected to fight, to either have sustained hits 2, devastating wounds, or lethal hits, which is freaking crazy, because that means at sustained hits 2, if you're rolling 5 attacks, you stand a pretty good chance of actually hitting like 7 times and then wounding on 2s, or into some targets with good invuln saves. Maybe you want to choose the devastating wounds. But that's really powerful. This guy can, like, pick up most of a unit of Marines, like a 5-man unit of Marines on his own. Put him into this other, like, beat stick package with 12 clowns plus Yvraine, and he is absolutely off the hook, out of control, making them all fight first. And at this point, the damage output of this combo of the Harlequins and Yvraine and the Vizark is kind of insane. So again, the standard way this list is going to want to play, I guess I'll just finish on this topic. Here's my own flowchart for this. So you can either run, you can either go all 14 clowns with the Vizark and Yvraine. That's one move. That gets pretty expensive in terms of points. That's like $395. Or you drop the Vizark and you run 10 clowns and 1 lead player at 165 plus Yvraine at 125, and then you stick them in the Wave Serpent for another 120. But the Wave Serpent is also a firing platform. It comes with some heavy weapons. It allows you to park in the midfield, kind of behind a piece of terrain. And then when this unit wants to come out, it comes out 3 inches from the hull, and then it can move 8 inches, and then it can charge, which is a really long threat range. And if you're starting your charge anywhere near the avatar, it has +1 to charge, and you can always use a stratagem or fate dice to cheat into succeeding on the charge. So the Wave Serpent extends the threat range, keeps them safe early on, and then also provides you with this, as Aeldari units go, kind of relatively inexpensive, durable firing platform that's also a scoring platform. And you might find that it's like kind of gets left alone, because if your opponent's heavy weapons are staring down the Avatar of Khaine and 10 Wraith Guard, prioritizing shooting your Wave Serpent once it's already disgorged the stuff in it is like not a high priority for your opponent. So it might just be able to like fly around and shoot stuff and score secondaries and be a nuisance and maybe use vehicle shock. And so, there it is. The standard way to play this list is to use the Wraith Guard, the big block of Wraith Guard led by the Spirit Seer and the Avatar of Khaine. These defensively buffed with some combination of Fortune and Lightning Fast to control multiple objectives in the midfield and bear down on your opponent while you blast at them with Wraith Cannons and overwatch them, and then also shoot them with the Wailing Doom, which can do sustained hits, and you have fate dice to cheat into that. And then you position your Harlequin threat with Yvraine and maybe the Visarch in or not in a Wave Serpent to like swoop in and counterpunch anything that your opponent tries to bring in to challenge the Wraith Guard or the Avatar. Or frankly, if your opponent has a way to get around those into something in your own backfield, the big block of clowns with Yvraine is like fast enough generally to like meet that threat also. This is a pretty powerful combo. And if you decide you want to run this list, you're looking at like you need to have the Autarch Wayleaper because it's CP hungry like most Aeldari lists. So you've got the Autarch Wayleaper. You need the Farseer to throw fortune on stuff because it's a durability build. That's a thing. And then on top of that, you've got the models that I've already mentioned. If you are running the Visarch, but you're not running the Wave Serpent, you're coming in at 370 points now accounted for. And if you take out one Harlequin to bring the squad down to 165 and you drop the Visarch, but you have the Wave Serpent, then it's like close to 1400. It's similar. Whatever version of this you run, about 1370 to 1400 points of your list are relatively deterministic, I think. And then you have about 600 points to do with as you will. And there are a lot of different ways to allocate these. But if you are playing competitively, you absolutely must spend a reasonably significant number of these points on dedicated scoring units. I think you need 3 that are just fast and somewhat disposable. Folger Piles, who I mentioned earlier in this video, has 2 units of Warp Spiders and 1 unit of Swooping Hawks. I think that's a perfectly reasonable way to approach this. I always like having 1 unit of Warp Spiders because I just like the option of that insane speed on turn 1 to score secondaries if you need to. But there are definitely other options. You could run more Hawks and fewer Spiders. You could get some Shadow Specters in there. I will say that I think this is actually not a great build for Shadow Specters. Shadow Specters like builds that want to seriously like keep their heads down while you get an advantage on your opponent. I think with this build, you don't like really need to worry about your opponent plinking away at your Shadow Specters because they're going to have other problems. So maybe you're just better off with Hawks and Spiders. But something like a Viper, infiltrating units like Rangers or Scorpions are an option. You can even do something like a Hornet, a super aggressive Warwalker that makes a scout move on the first turn. But you're going to need some. You're going to need some disposable scoring units. And again, I think you want 3 of those. Probably largely just based on like what's in your collection. The Autarch Wayleaper with that you're obviously going to give the fusion gun and the glaive, and you can or cannot give the Phoenix Gem to. If you have the points, I think it's a good move in this list. Can help you control the objective in your own backfield. Now, again, because everything in this list is quite forward, you might also want to think about a couple things in your own backfield that can help you with denying enemy deep strikers. It tends to not be a super great build for D cannons because you're putting so much pressure on the midfield that your opponent isn't necessarily efficiently getting into range of your D cannons. But other inexpensive long-range units that can screen out enemy deep strikers and still participate in the battle and just might not be priorities for your opponent to shoot out at, like maybe some Dark Reapers or something, also not a bad idea. Thinking about how you're going to score, thinking about how you're going to screen your backfield, these are important. They're the most important, scoring and screening. I think the last consideration, if you want to use some of those 600 points to squeeze in some super long-range shooting, I think that this type of Aeldari build could run into some trouble against really powerful shooting lists that can just sort of hang back, gunliney lists. There's one like particular type of Space Marine Gladius Task Force list that does this with like gunboats and stuff. Stuff that can just hang back out of range of the Avatar and the Wraith Guard and put enough heavy fire on those units in the first couple turns of the game to try to eat away at them. You might want to take some ultra long range units that could give you some kind of answer to that a bit. There are enough points that if you wanted to take a Falcon and stick some Fire Dragons in it, and maybe even with Fugan, you could. If you want to take a Farseer Skyrunner and also take a bunch of Farseers with, not Farseers, Wind Riders with Shuriken Cannons and sustained hits and that like guide trick that I've talked about before, and possibly even a Warlock in there, to move around and help you score, but also like take out big blocks of medium weight infantry. If that's a thing in your meta, you could. There are still enough points to play with in this build that you can personalize it and you can have other tools available to you, which I think is really neat. But I would advise you, before you think about anything else, to think about how you're going to score secondaries and what sorts of fast disposable units you want at your fingertips to do that. I really do think that after the initial like triple threat inclusion and making sure you're using those tactically effectively and you have the tools in place to make them efficient, those scoring units really are they're the next priority. And that's what I've got for this one. Again, I am not implying that this is the only competitive way to run Aeldari right now. It's an excellent way to run them, and it's also just like a fun kind of different way to play your Space Elves. If you are accustomed to playing a more traditional Space Elf list, like the ones that I usually run, that are all about like getting position and then hitting really hard so your opponent can't smack you back, or ducking and covering until you've got advantage and so your opponent can't hit you back. Like this is like it's a fun different approach to Space Elves, and that has its own value. If you have your own ideas about how best to use the triple threat Aeldari build, or if you have questions about it, or if you just want to say hello, or if you just want to help out your algorithm, my algorithm, not your algorithm, I hope that you will leave something relevant in the comments below. If you liked this video, I hope that you will click like. If you would like to consider joining our Discord by becoming a Patreon so that you can connect a little bit more personally and get early access to some stuff and talk to other people who like this content, I hope that you might consider $3 a month for that. I think it's pretty good value. In any event, I hope to be back soon with something new. And until then, best of luck with your pointy ears.